Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we are going to analyze the Hindu New Delhi edition dated 29th of November 2019. Displayed on the screen is the list of articles that we are going to cover today. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description of the video. Let's begin our analysis. We have taken this article from page number 10 and it talks about India's food basket must be enlarged. At the same time, it talks about agrobiodiversity can help improve India's poor ranking in Global Hunger Index. As far as this topic is concerned, this is important more from the perspective of social issues, and this will become the part of health. The topic as such is very good and it is important from the perspective of mains examination. And at the same time, there are few aspects which can be asked in the prelims examination as well. So please pay attention to the analysis which is now being done. Before going for the analysis of article, let's first understand the context of the article. We know that hunger and malnutrition have emerged as the biggest challenge for India and many countries in the developing world. Through this article, the author highlights that the problem can be solved through conservation of biodiversity and expanding the food basket. The promotion of biodiversity would ensure dual purpose of ensuring food and nutritional security. It will also ensure that genetic conservation of plants take place. So in this context, we need to understand this article from two perspectives. First, food security, and second is nutritional security. The authors highlight that India and many developing countries have been focusing more on food security and they haven't paid enough attention to nutritional security. And hence, the problem of hunger and malnutrition has not been solved. In this context, the expansion of food basket and agrobiodiversity can help us solve the problem of hunger and malnutrition in a better way. Let's first understand what the author means by hunger and malnutrition. Now we are aware of the fact that India ranks 102 out of 117 countries in the Global Hunger Index. The author also highlights what is defined as hunger. Now author has defined hunger as a combination of three things. First, caloric deprivation, in which it means that people are not getting enough calories and hence they do not have enough energy to do their work in an efficient manner. Second important aspect is protein deprivation. When we talk about protein deprivation, it relates to a kind of situation in which children and people may suffer stunting or retarded growth. The third important aspect is deficiency in micronutrients. Now we know that micronutrients are very important for the proper functioning of body. In this case, when hunger is decided, all three of them means caloric deprivation, protein deprivation, and deficiency of micronutrients is highlighted. In this form, the hunger leads to malnutrition. So when people are not getting enough calories, they're not getting proteins, and they're not getting micronutrients, then it means this leads to malnutrition. At the same time, we need to understand malnutrition and its impact on India as such. Now, when we focus on malnutrition, there are three aspects which are highlighted. First and foremost, we can highlight about undernutrition. It means in a situation, people are not getting enough food to develop properly. They may be running short of calories, proteins, or other micronutrients. Second important aspect of malnutrition is related to obesity. Now, this is important that according to WHO's definition of malnutrition, all three, undernutrition, obesity, and micronutrients, fall under the category of malnutrition. In the case of obesity, it is said that the people have increased their consumption of fats or other fattening substance, but at the same time, their food habits are not balanced. And hence, this also comes under malnutrition because important ingredients which are required for the proper development of human body are not present. And hence, it is considered a malnutrition. The third aspect is micronutrients itself. As already mentioned, that this is another important aspect of hunger as well. Now, when we talk about the definition of malnutrition, malnutrition was traditionally related to the concept of poverty. However, the authors highlight that poverty is definitely an important reason for malnutrition, but at the same time, there is lack of balanced diet, which is also a cause of malnutrition. And this lack of balanced diet is because of the fact that our food basket is not expanded. Our food basket is dominated primarily by rice and wheat, and which make 50% of our food need. And this is the reason why hunger and malnutrition have not been solved even when food security is targeted for a very long period of time. It means the author highlight another important aspect which is related to nutritional security. Now author explains that malnutrition has much more bigger impact on women. And when it impacts women, it impacts the entire nation. Now we know that India is more of a patriarchal society, and in a patriarchal society, women are at the receiving end. They do not get sufficient food and attention, and they are primarily malnourished and anemic. The author quotes that around 50% of women in India are anemic in nature. Now, when these women who are malnourished and are anemic, when they enter the fertile stage, they start impacting the child which is yet to be born. When these malnourished and anemic women give birth to children, these children are again malnourished in nature. And this is a big loss to the human capital formation. When these undernourished or malnourished women give birth to children, these children are stunted and have reduced learning capacity. Ultimately, such form of malnutrition prevents children from reaching their full potential, and this is a greatest loss to a nation. And hence, the problem of hunger, malnutrition can be related to the problem of nation's development. In this context, the author talks about expanding food basket and utilizing agrobiodiversity that is available to us. Now let us try to understand the linkage between agrobiodiversity and nutritional security. For this particular purpose, let's also understand food security. Now many countries, including India, have been focusing on food security, which focused on giving food to its people. At the same time, enough attention was not given to balanced diet. And in this context, the food security requires the support of nutritional security. And this is where the author says that there's a need for nutritional security apart from food security. In this context, the author highlights that there are 250,000 varieties of plants. And if we focus on these 250,000 varieties, 7,000 of them can be utilized for the food habits or nutrition. At the same time, out of these 7,000, roughly 30 of them cater to 90 to 95% of our dietary needs. This basically leads to malnutrition, which author wants to address by expanding the food basket and including agrobiodiversity, which can help India to acquire nutritional as well as food security. In this particular purpose, the author highlights a very significant example. In this case, the author highlights a very important and significant example. Over a period of time, the consumption of millet has come down. And as the consumption of millets has come down, this led to decrease in protein, vitamin A, iron and iodine level in women and children. Thus, there is a clear link between United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 2, which relates to zero hunger, and Aichi biodiversity target for genetic conservation of plants, livestock, and wild relatives. So, in this case, the author highlights that there is a need to first address hunger and conserve biodiversity. In this context, the author highlights how to promote agrobiodiversity in India. Now, first we need to understand why there was fall in agrodiversity in India. The first thing that we need to understand that the consumption pattern has changed. At the same time, the dietary habits has changed, and the low yield of traditional variety has also worked against the biodiversity. At the same time, conversion of irrigated areas for the cultivation of rice and wheat has also contributed in lack of agrobiodiversity in India. In this case, author suggests some of the measures to improve agrobiodiversity in India. The first such measure is globally important agriculture heritage systems. Now, when we talk about this organization or system, it is promoted by Food and Agriculture Organization, and the objective of this system is to promote sustainable agriculture. Globally, they have identified 37 sites. Out of these 37, 3 are in India, which include Kashmir, Koraput, and Kutanad. These 3 sites of India are important from the prelims examination, and you should make a note of that. Next important aspect is biodiversity hotspots. Now, as per the Biological Diversity Act, state governments may, in consultation with the local bodies, can notify areas of biodiversity importance as biodiversity heritage sites or BHS. Hence, the important agrobiodiversity areas or hotspots can be designated as BHS under the provisions of Biological Diversity Act. And this can actually contribute in maintaining biodiversity and expanding the food basket of India. The third important aspect is conservation of traditional seed varieties. Now, in consultation with local communities, seed banks can be set up in each agroclimatic zone so that these traditional varieties are used by new generation of farmers. The more we promote these farmers to produce traditional seed varieties, the better it will become to maintain the biodiversity of these regions. Next important aspect is Agro Biodiversity Index. This Agro Biodiversity Index can be prepared to measure and manage agro biodiversity across 4 dimensions. And these dimensions are first, diets, second is production, third is seed, and fourth is conservation. All these things are important to manage the right balance in terms of agro biodiversity index. Moreover, this will help the policymakers to ensure that food systems are diverse and sustainable. Next important aspect can be people's biodiversity registers management committees. Now, it is very important to engage local communities in ensuring that they maintain agro biodiversity of their local areas. They can be promoted at various levels, and in this fashion, we can include agro biodiversity and expansion of food basket. Apart from that, we also need to have a strategy to deal with alien species. A national level invasive alien species strategies need to be developed for managing, controlling, and eradicating agriculture related invasive alien species, and a database of these species should be developed. Now, this is important from the environmental aspect as well. Now, with this, we come to the way forward. Now, before moving to the way forward, let's first understand the problems at hand. First, there is a loss of biodiversity. And this loss of biodiversity has led to nutritional insecurity. Hence, going forward, there is a need to mainstream biodiversity into our agriculture policies to address dual problem of genetic loss and malnutrition. At the same time, people's participation is key to ensure that this biodiversity is maintained and is thriving for the time to come. We have taken this article from page number 10 and it is part of the editorial section. It talks about the widening gap. Now, United Nations Environment Program has released Emission Gap Report for 2019, and this is the 10th year in which this report has been published. This report is primarily important from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions, and it also acts as a report card of the efforts of the countries to control greenhouse gas emissions. The important highlight of this report is that it says that we are on the verge of missing limiting the increase in temperature as agreed in the Paris Agreement of 2015. As you might be aware that according to Paris Agreement, we would collectively like to limit the global increase in temperature by 2 degrees Celsius at the end of this century, that is 2100. At the same time, it is expected that we should do better, and the better goal would be 1.5 degrees Celsius by the same period. In this context, it is important to go through the findings of the emission gap report. In order to understand the basics of emission gap report, we have converted the major findings into questions. Let's take the question number 1, which says that what is emission gap? The emission gap can also be called as a commitment gap. It measures the gap between what we need to do and what we actually do to tackle the challenge of climate change. The gap is a difference between low level of emissions that the world needs to drop to compared with the projected level of emissions based on countries' current commitments to decarbonization. It also implies that goals have been quantitatively decided, and this is an important aspect of this emission gap report. Now, the second important question is, why does the emission gap matter? Now, these emission gaps matter because if we can't close it and meet the emission reduction target, we will face increasingly severe climate impacts, and that too on a worldwide scale level. It is important that policymakers and their citizens know what the gap is so that the commitments countries are making are sufficient to close the gap. As already mentioned, since the goals are quantitatively decided and hence countries need to achieve goals in a quantitative, time bound manner. As already mentioned, this report actually acts as a report card for all countries in terms of their achievement and their commitments. Now, when we focus on the three basic things that this report measures, it first measures the amount of greenhouse gas emissions every year and up to 2030. Now, the important factor is to understand why 2030 has been highlighted. It has been highlighted because if we work in the right fashion till 2030, then the chances are that we can achieve our targets. However, if sufficient efforts are not garnered by 2030, this goal will become unachievable. Second important aspect is that countries make commitments to reduce their emissions, and the impact of these commitments are likely to have an overall emission reduction. So we need to continuously judge and measure how well these commitments are met. The pace at which emissions must be reduced to reach an emission low that would limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that too in an affordable fashion. We need to understand that countries need to balance their development and climate needs to find a perfect balance for them. And hence, all these three measures are important to measure. The report also identifies key opportunities for each country to increase the pace of emission reduction necessary to close the gap. So in this way, these are the three important aspects. First is the emission gap, and why does this emission gap matter, and what this report is measuring. Now let's move to the other important points of this emission gap report. The fourth question that we need to understand, how are we doing it? Now the idea of the question is how well we have done so far and what is expected if we delay this timeline to some extent. The next important question that we need to answer is, how are we doing it? Now let's take a reference from 2010, which has been taken by UNEP itself, and let's do the projection till 2030. In 2010, the emission of carbon dioxide was 50 gigatons. And if we want to reach to our objectives by 2030, we need to reduce to 25 gigatons of carbon dioxide. It means that if we had started in 2010, the rate of fall should have been 3.3%. But now, as we see it, the gap is ever expanding. And this is the cause of concern for all of us. Why? Even if we start from 2020 and try to achieve the goal that has been laid out through Paris Agreement, it means that we need to go at the rate of 7.6% cut in the emissions of greenhouse gases. Still, this looks a very far-fetched idea, and more practical way of looking at things is the world community will start working on it by 2025, and in that case, we would require a cut of around 15.4%. If we delay it to such an extent that we start in 2025, then this whole exercise might become futile because such huge or drastic cut in emissions wouldn't be possible by the extent of technology that we have. And hence, we need to understand how well we are doing it and what kind of a commitment we are making and meeting at the same time. Now, let us move towards the most pertinent question of the discussion. Where do the emissions come from? Now, if we talk about the G20 countries, these countries are responsible for 78% of the all emissions that we see today. The top four emitters, when you talk about, are China, USA, European Union as a group of 28 countries, and India, contribute over 55% of global emissions. And since we are talking about global emissions, we are focusing for the time period between 2009 to 2019. Now, it is important to know that out of these G20 countries, only 5 G20 members have committed to long term zero emissions targets, of which 3 are currently in the process of passing the legislation and 2 have recently passed the legislation. It means that we need to understand that the kind of a deadline we have talked about in this case, it is going to be missed in any case. So, the next best timeline with which we can expect some action to be taken at a global scale would emerge to be 2025. And in this case, it will become a far more difficult challenge to limit greenhouse gas emissions as per the requirement of 2030. The largest share of emissions come from energy sector and its fossil fuel emissions. Industry produces the next largest footprint and it is followed by forestry, transport, agriculture and buildings. So in this way we can see where exactly the emissions come from. Now the next question becomes very important. Can we still close the gap or we have lost this battle? Now the news is good because we have the technology and science to decarbonize our energy sources, transport systems and cities. And by this logic, if we try to cut 7.6% from the year 2020, we shall be in a position to reach to the global target of 25 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. At the same time, we need to actually halt deforestation and scale reforestation. And these actions are affordable today. But at the same time, they require commitment from governments and they have to be backed by the citizens. At the same time, it is heartening to know that many citizen groups and NGOs have accepted that climate change is the biggest challenge against humanity. And in this case, they are willing to make sacrifices to ensure that whatever commitments government make, they achieve them as well. So, what are the possible solutions? Now, the solutions that we are talking about are actually possible as well, and at the same time, they are very necessary. First and foremost, we need to go for a full decarbonization of energy sector. At the same time, we need to focus on renewable energy and need to focus on ensuring better efficiency in our machine, tools, and equipments. It is important here to highlight that the potential emission reduction to renewable energy electricity will amount to 12.1 gigatons by 2050. If we achieve this feat, it would mean that it is equal to 2.5 million coal power stations for 1 year. And this is actually more than the total number of coal power operating across the world. At the same time, electrification of transport could reduce sector CO2 emissions by a huge 72% by 2050. So, in this sense, when you talk about different sectors, we have to focus on all the sectors and we need to harness renewable energy as much as possible. At the same time, we need to protect our natural resources, lives and livelihoods, and transition to decarbonization pathway. So this brings us to the end of the discussion of this topic. At the same time, we need to focus about India as well. India is a fast developing country and it needs to balance its development and climate related responsibilities. At the same time, India is one of the largest polluter as well. So India has the responsibility to control greenhouse gas emissions. In this case, India need to invest in the renewable energy and find alternate ways to employ people by creating job opportunities in this new sector. We have taken this news from page number 1 and it has also been covered on page number 12. And it talks about Google warned 500 Indians on phishing. Now, as far as this topic is concerned, this will come under General Studies Paper 3 under Technology. As a subtopic, it will be covered under Awareness in the field of IT, space, computers, robotics, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and issues related to intellectual property rights. This topic will also be important from the perspective of cyber security. At the same time, this topic is important for prelims as well as mains. So let's first understand the context of the news. Now, Google, through Threat Analysis Group, has actually notified that between July and September of this year, more than 12,000 Google accounts were victim of government-backed phishing attacks. This becomes very important from the perspective that recently we have seen Pegasus attack as well. Also important here is to understand that this threat analysis group has said that attackers were government-backed, but it is not clear which government is behind the attacks. So this is something which is more of a mystery that we need to find out. In the same news, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, who is Electronics and Information Technology Minister, has commented on the spyware Pegasus from Israeli company, and in which he has clearly mentioned in Rajya Sabha that there was no unauthorized interception as far as he knew. So in this context, it is important to understand what are phishing attacks and how a government can be involved in a phishing attack as well. So let's understand, why do governments sponsor phishing attacks? Now, the first thing that comes to our mind is the intelligence collection. We know that many governments across the world are working in a democratic setup. Still, these democratic setup may require intelligence about people and their intention. At the same time, we are living in a multicultural world which is affected by terrorism and many other problems. In that case, intelligence collection can be one of the objectives of the government. Second important object is stealing of intellectual property. Now we know that governments have a welfare objective as well. At the same time, they may require sensitive information for the strategic interest of the country. And in this context, the government may resort to stealing of intellectual property as well. As we have seen that recent development of China is not only fueled by the industrious nature of the people and the policy they have adopted, but at times with the stealing of intellectual property as well, for which US has blamed China many times over. So this again is an important aspect of government-sponsored phishing attack. Third important aspect is targeting dissidents and activists. Now, as I already mentioned, many governments across the world are of democratic setup. But at the same time, there are many royalties and there are many authoritarian governments. These governments target the dissidents and their activists to ensure that they maintain power in their hands for a longer period of duration. And hence, these government-sponsored phishing attacks are very common in such countries. One such example would be North Korea, and many countries of West Asia do resort to government-sponsored phishing attack. Next can be destructive cyber attacks. And when we talk about destructive cyber attacks, we understand that governments have strategic interest and at times they want to impair enemy countries. Now, internet and computers are backbone for most of the countries. In such a case, if we limit the IT potential of the country, this can be in the favor of strategic interest for some countries against their enemies. And hence, destructive cyber attacks are also done by the governments. These destructive cyber attacks are also done when a country wants to steal strategic information from other country. And hence, this is one of the most widely used form of phishing attack. Next important aspect is spreading coordinated disinformation. Now, in the recent past, we have seen that information and its dissemination can form or ruin a government. And hence, spreading coordinated disinformation is again an important aspect of the phishing attacks which is conducted by the government. We have seen that in North Korea and in many other authoritarian countries, this form of phishing attack is very widely practiced. So in this fashion, we can understand why do governments sponsor phishing attacks. Now, since we have talked about government-sponsored phishing attack, we need to focus on the targets of such attacks. Now, when we talk about targets, the kind of phishing that is done is called as credential phishing. In such a case, account and passwords are obtained to hijack the account of the targets. In this fashion, target has no knowledge that the security of his or her account is compromised. At the same time, through this system, hackers can take out information at their will. As already mentioned, we are talking about government-sponsored phishing attack, and hence some of the common target of these kind of phishing attacks are journalists, human rights activists, and political campaigners. So in this fashion, you can actually understand the context of the news. You can also understand why do government sponsor phishing attack, at the same time what are the targets. In this context, we need to know more about what is phishing. Now let us understand what is phishing and how it is done. Now let us understand what is phishing. Now phishing is a form of email spam where a perpetrator sends an official looking fraudulent email message in an attempt to obtain victims' personal and financial information. The important point that we need to understand that this email is official looking, and in this way many people are tricked to share their personal and sensitive information. At the same time, in recent days, zombie computers or botnets are increasingly used for launching phishing attacks. Now, this is something which is important from the perspective of this article as well, as Threat Analysis Group has commented that it could not identify the government. When these attacks are carried by zombie computers or botnets, actually these attacks can be carried out from anywhere, and hence it is difficult to pinpoint the location of these attacks and at the same time fix responsibility for the specific government. And hence this is an important aspect that you need to understand. So the first point is how phishing is done. Now the second important aspect is the modus operandi or how it actually works. As already mentioned, phishing is a kind of an email which may ask for specific personal information. At the same time, this may also have a message which may take you to the malicious website or generate a pop-up window which may capture your information or data. Third important aspect is email message may lure user into downloading a Trojan, which is a malicious file, or a ransomware or any other type of malware onto their computers. So this is a system once we induce person to open a mail and read it seriously. And the second important aspect is through phishing, hackers basically try to seek information, and at times they plant Trojan or ransomware to steal information in the future as well. Now, when you talk about phishing, this is not limited only to computers. Phishing attempts can be made via telephone, text messages, or social media or in apps. Now, when we talked about Pegasus recently, we knew that Pegasus operated through WhatsApp. Last but not the least, we need to understand about the objective, why identity theft is done. Last but not the least, we need to focus on the objective, and we know that identity theft and financial fraud are the objectives of these kind of phishing. Now, the primary objective of phishing attack is to obtain personal information of the victim. The phishing email looks like a legitimate and requests credit card numbers, Aadhaar number, bank account number, passwords, or any other private information which can be utilized for hijacking into the account. The personal information can then be used for identity theft, primarily for financial frauds. So as already mentioned, phishing is primarily targeted against financial frauds or theft of identity. But at the same time, in some cases, it has been seen that government also sponsors phishing attacks. Now, in continuation of what we have talked about phishing, we also should know more about cyber crimes against individuals. And when we talk about cyber crimes, we can talk about cyber stalking, hacking, cracking, defamation, online fraud, dissemination of obscene material, child pornography, and spoofing. Now, we have mentioned this list in the PDF of this video. Please go through this and make notes of these terms which are mentioned. These may be asked in the prelim examination to see how well you understand these terms. We have taken this news from page number 9, and it talks about not for defense purchases worth 22,800 crore. Now, this topic is important more from the perspective of science and technology, and defense would be its subtopic. This is also important from the perspective of India-US relations, as US has been trying to sell weapons to India for a long period of time. In this case, it is important to understand the context of the news. Now, before entering into the nitty-gritty of the article, let's first understand the context. The Defence Acquisition Council has approved defence procurement worth rupees 22,800 crores. Now, when we talk about these defence procurement, they are basically done with the US, and the company involved primarily is Boeing. Through this deal, 6 more Poseidon 8L, a maritime patrol aircraft for Indian Navy from the US. Second, AWACS, that is Airborne Warning and Control System for Indian Air Force to be developed indigenously by the DRDO. Currently, we use Netra system for a similar activity. Third important aspect is thermal imaging night sights for assault rifles. And last but not the least is a twin engine helicopter for the Coast Guard. Now let us understand the basic purpose of making such deals. Now these deals are important for the defense capability and they also have a deterrent effect. At the same time, it is important to understand that in the aftermath of 2611, India has felt its need to improve its search and rescue capabilities. There has been an emergent need which is hanging for a very long period of time that Navy requires an estimated 22 long-range patrol aircrafts. While India has already acquired 12 of them, approval for 6 of them has been granted for them. So it means that still Navy requires 4 more such aircrafts. Now let us understand few of the important or standout features of Poseidon 8L. Now the first and foremost, Poseidon is a sophisticated anti-submarine warfare aircraft. Now this is important from the perspective because India is surrounded by many countries which basically try to contain it. This includes China and Pakistan. China has many submarines which enter Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea. In this context, it is important for India to have a credible defense mechanism. Another standout feature of this aircraft is that it can operate from 40,000 feet and it has got an operational speed of 450 miles per hour and a range of 4,500 nautical miles. So through the acquisition of these aircrafts, Indian Navy will be strengthened and there will be better monitoring of coast and India's strategic interest. Now these aircraft are equipped with active electronic scanned array system and these radars are capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Magnetic anomaly detection or MAD radar will also help locate submarines in deep seas. The Indian version of Poseidon 8 is equipped with latest missile which is Harpoon Block 2 missile, Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes to enhance its anti-submarine warfare capability. So this is something which is very strategic and important for India's defense needs. Second important thing that we need to talk about is AWACS. The full form of AWACS is Airborne Warning and Control System. Now recently, when Indian Air Force engaged with Pakistani Air Force, they realized the need of AWACS aircrafts. And in this context, it is important acquisition for India. Now, Indian Air Force has undergone a doctrinal shift from conventional warfare to sub-conventional warfare due to threats from proxy wars by Pakistan's deep state post-1990s. Thus, India identified the key operational requirement for IF in the aftermath of Balakot strike. Now, AWACS is one of the short-term operational requirements identified by the IAS. Now, let's try to understand what is the importance of AWACS. Now, AWACS are also known as eyes in the sky, and they are airborne radar systems mounted on the aircraft for scanning and surveillance. They have a 360-degree span and they can be deployed to carry out the surveillance on enemy air defense systems and to prepare air situation picture useful for aerial combats. So this is something which is very important for Indian Air Force. In the current state, India has 5 AWACS. 3 are Falcon AWACS, which are procured from Israel. India also has 2 Netra, Airborne Early Warning and Control System, that is AE, W and C. The system is indigenously developed by DRDO and was first used in the Balakot airstrike. The Netra AWACS is mounted on an Embraer aircraft and was for the first time used in the aerial combat by the IAS. Apart from that, India is also procuring two-engine heavy helicopter, and these are important for the Coast Guard. The basic role of these helicopters would be to prevent maritime terrorism, infiltration of terrorists by sea, search and rescue operation. So these are the basic acquisitions of this 22,800 crore deal between India and US. Now there is an article on page number 10 which talks about not as you say but as you do. Now this article basically focuses about India and Sri Lanka relations, especially after the winning of Gotabaya for the presidential position. Now India has had a bittersweet relation with Rajpaksa family, especially in 2015, where Mahinda Rajpaksa blamed India for the electoral loss. Now this topic was very well covered on 18th of November 2019 by Baswasar. In this article, Baswasar has clearly defined what is the China factor, the Tamil factor, the fisherman issue, the security issue, and the trade factor which are involved for the continuous engagement with Sri Lanka. Now, in this purpose, it is important for you to go back to this article and understand the perspective which was shared by Basavasar. Apart from that, there is nothing much new in the article. At the same time, you should also pay attention to the neighborhood first policy. So, if you cover this article in detail, there won't be anything much that you can learn from this article. And hence, it is expected that you will go through the details of 18th November article, which has already been done. Now we have taken two questions from the topic that we have not covered today, but at the same time they are important for the general understanding. The first topic is US to cut spending on NATO budget and Germany has to pay more. Now this article highlights that US has decided to cut its contribution to the NATO. At the same time, for whatever cut US has made, Germany is trying to chip in. Now there is a very specific reason for that. US has been complaining against the attitude of European Union countries and in turn wants to reduce its contribution to the NATO goals. In the current scheme of things, US contributes around 22.1% of the total NATO's budget. US also want that European Union members should contribute at least 2% for the defense. Hence in this context, this article is important for your general awareness. Let's take up a question on that. With reference to NATO, that is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, consider the following statement. First, it has been set up through the Brussels Treaty to provide collective security against the erstwhile Soviet Union. Second, as per the provisions, if one member of the alliance is attacked, it is considered to be attack on all members. Now you should know that North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO is a military alliance established between North Atlantic Treaty, also called as Washington Treaty of April 4, 1949 by the United States, Canada and several Western European nations to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. The key provisions of the treaty, the so-called Article 5, states that if one member of the alliance is attacked in Europe or North America, it is to be considered an attack on all members. Thus, effectively put Western Europe under the nuclear umbrella of the US. By this understanding, we know that statement 1 is incorrect and statement 2 is right. Hence, the correct answer is option B. Second small news is Army test fires Israeli anti-tank missile. Now, this small news talks about newly acquired Spike long-range anti-tank guided missile at the infantry school of Mau, Madhya Pradesh. Based on this, let's take up a question. Which among the following are indigenously developed anti-tank missiles in India? First, Amog missile, second, Nag missile, and third is Helena. The correct answer is all three of them are indigenously developed, and hence the correct answer is option D. With this, we have come to the end of today's session. Let's move to the question of the day.